Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dawn of Drones. I'm Dawn Zoldi, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. We are continuing a month dedicated to global industry leaders, sponsored by Mission Go. But what an incredible leader we have with us today, Rex Alexander, the CEO and founder of 5 Alpha. Rex, if you don't know him, I don't know where you've been, honestly, because this guy is out and about. He is a world-renowned expert on heliports, and now vertiports, and this thing we're not quite sure exactly what it is, drone ports. We're going to get to that towards the end of the show. But Rex, so great to have you on the show again.
Now, welcome to everybody, and thanks, Dawn, for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it. Always enjoy talking to you on everything aviation.
Very good, very good. Well, I said again because Rex was actually on our legacy podcast called Drones at Dawn, which we did with InnerDrone, Mike Peel, my producer, and myself. And I think in that show, Rex, you were with Yolanka Wolf from the Community Air Mobility Initiative, talking about advanced air mobility then. So check that out, everybody. That's actually on my P3 Tech website. I've got all those legacy podcasts up there. But we're going to go ahead and focus today on this idea of vertiports, heliports, drone ports. And Rex, I know you have just extensive experience in aviation, 35 years as a helicopter pilot, 25 years doing heliport design. So what I want to do first to kind of set the stage here is because we're going to be drawing parallels between the helicopter world and advanced air mobility or vertical takeoff and landing. Why don't we roll a video where you can kind of walk us through the different pieces and parts, I know that's a technical term, of a heliport, and then that way we can understand better like all the other things we're going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and do that, and I'm going to let you guide us, Rex.
Okay, sounds great. So we did this as a build-up for clients. So you have the T-loft, the touchdown liftoff area, the lighting perimeter lights around that. And then with that, we put in a 12-inch white perimeter for the T-loft to market. Then the H goes in the middle. That's lined with the predominant approach departure path. You have the information box with the max gross weight and the max rotor diameter. Directional arrows for approach departure paths. And the H is a specific size. The information box as well, so the pilot knows how much how big of an aircraft it will take. Generally put it, and this is a ground-based heliport, shows it on a slight berm, makes for much better water runoff. And then those other areas of the FADO and the T-loft are in white and green. Approach departure lighting. You see the approach departure path, which is green for the 8-to-1, blue for the 2-to-1s. This is a surface that's protected by the FAA's Part 157 and 77. And there you see 2 approach departure paths into and out of the heliport. Now remember that the approach departure path is what we protect. So the helicopter is not going to generally fly that because it's only 7.125 degrees. Most helicopter pilots are flying about 10, 12, 15 degrees into any heliport, but that's what we protect to. So that's a real quick and dirty. You have the T-loft, the FADO, the safety area, the 2-to-1s, the 8-to-1s, and the approach departure paths, and then all the different markings and lighting that goes into, and that's a heliport.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, because I don't know what this is, a 2-to-1 and an 8-to-1. What do you mean by that?
All right, so an 8-to-1, when you look at the protected surface that's spelled out in the Code of Federal Regulations, they talk about the approach surface. So for every 8 feet that you extend horizontally from the edge of the FADO at FADO height, and the FADO being the final approach and takeoff or maneuver area, you then come up 1 foot. So at 80 feet, now you're at 10 feet. At 800 feet, you're at 100 feet. What that means is that is the floor that you want to maintain non-obstructing surfaces. You don't want anything to penetrate that floor. It's like a ramp into the sky. So the 8-to-1 is for the surface that we're trying to protect. The 2-to-1 on the outside of the 8-to-1 you saw in blue, that's the surface on the perimeter, which is a transitional surface. That's the area that we want to protect. So every 2 feet you go out horizontally, you come up 1 foot. And that's along the center line of the approach departure path, either side 250 feet. So your corridor is 500 feet wide by 4,000 feet long.
Wow.
Starts at 500 feet high.
Okay. I mean, I've already learned so much, honestly, that I didn't know. And, things I didn't think about, Rex. No, seriously, like common sense things like water runoff, like in building these heliports in a way that water's just not sitting on there. And the lighting, I know all of these things are in certain standards, and we're gonna get to that when it comes to vertiports, right? But let's step back for a second before we talk more about design of the actual ports and all of these things. I want to get to terminology a little bit because, right, you and I, we always talk about this, Rex, words matter. And so let's talk about, what's the difference between, let's start with heliports, a heliport and a helipad.
Good question, because that trips a lot of people up. Right. So I always try to reference anything that's defined by a regulation, because a regulation is something you can hang your hat on and it has teeth. So in the grand scheme of everything code and planning and land use, I always want to use the term heliport because the Code of Federal Regulations defines that in Part 1. Right. The FAA also uses the term heliport in other places, but we can go to that. So a heliport, by definition, is an area of land or water or structure used or intended to be used for landing and takeoff of helicopters. Now, there's a couple other places in the FAA that there's a few idiosyncrasies difference, but that's pretty much what we're looking at. Now, a helipad is not defined in any regulation. It is only defined in the Aeronautical Information Manual, and it's not really what the term you want to use. A helipad is only a part of a heliport. So when we talk about the 3 parts of a heliport, it's the touchdown liftoff area or TLOF, the final approach and takeoff area or FATO, and then the safety area. A helipad is really only the TLOF. So if you make a regulation for a helipad, really in essence, you only are covering a part of a heliport. Now, the other term that we use that I lean on is helistop. Now, the FAA doesn't really do a good job of defining that term. Where you use that term the most is not in the airspace world with the FAA, because the airspace and the geometry of a helistop is identical to that of a heliport. And the FAA has nothing on the books to capture that term. It's either a heliport or an airport. There's nowhere you can actually call it a helistop unless you give it the name helistop. Where it's important is zoning, because fire code and building code recognize a difference, and they basically say that a heliport is just what we just called it by the FAA, but they call a helistop exactly the same as a heliport, except no refueling, no storage of an aircraft, no hangar, and no maintenance will be done there.
Okay.
So if you're
it's
calling
more
it
like
a helistop,
touch and go.
So it's one of those terms that's defined in a standard and a regulation. And you'd asked some of the other ones out there, if it's on a oil platform, we call it a helideck.
Oh, okay, a helideck.
If it's,
so what if it's just like an emergency situation where like you have to land in a field? Is there a name for that?
Yes, there are 2 names for emergency operations. We all recognize emergency scenes, so we call things scenes all the time. Those are a one and done type operation on the interstate somewhere.
Yeah.
The air medical industry, along with first responders, have another term that we use a lot that the FAA has yet to recognize, and that's called a PELA, pre-designated emergency landing area. So if you go to a county a lot in a specific area, what we do is we say, hey, we're going to rendezvous at this point every time we come in this location, because we can check it out in the daytime. We can both agree on its safety. We can keep it clear. And at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're setting something up, better to come here than try to land on an interstate. So the other one in that space, it's one level up. It's called an EHLF. LA, there's all these people in LA that think they have all these heliports on all these roofs. I said, no, those are emergency helicopter landing facilities. They've never been looked at by the FAA. They've never been looked at by Caltrans. And the guy that actually oversees that is the fire marshal. And
Wow.
I've crawled around a lot of EHLFs, and I would never want to land a helicopter on some of them.
Well, I mean, you almost need a chart for this terminology, and that's just in the helicopter world. Let's bring it sideways over to the vertiport world, because you know, you and I've talked about this in the beginning. People are like, oh, we'll just use the, you know, FAA's advisory circular that deals with vertiport design, right? Like, and
Right.
you know, and all of that terminology. You know, we'll get to the actual aircraft and why they're different. And those aircraft, I think the design and the characteristics will drive, obviously, some of the design characteristics of the vertiport, vertistop. But let's talk about some of those terms. So a vertiport, how is that being defined today?
Well, it's not a whole lot different than what we use for the term heliport, in that when we define the term for vertiport, we lean pretty heavily on what language we already had, because for taxonomy purposes, it just made sense. So vertiport basically is an area of land or structure used or intended to be used for electric, hydrogen, and hybrid VTOL aircraft landing and taking off, including the associated building and facilities. So they quantify it a little bit more by using those terms of electric, hybrid, and hydrogen for VTOL. The question then comes, can you use a vertiport to land a helicopter? And can you use a heliport to land a eVTOL aircraft? Yet to be determined.
Well, I've got more questions for you, because man, we're going to run out of time before we get this interview. We're going to have multiple interviews, Rex. But so first of all, my first question is, where is that definition located? Is that in the FAA's engineering brief on vertiport
Correct.
design?
If that's and here's one of the things that I'm very, very proud of, is that one of the things we work at really, really hard is harmony amongst terminology. And when you look at the definition that's used in the FAA's engineering brief number 105, it's also the exact same definition that you'll find in ASTM International's vertiport standard. It's the same definition that you'll find in the National Fire Protection Association heliport and vertiport draft standard. It's also the same definition you'll find in the Illuminating Engineering Society's lighting for airports and heliports standard. And I wrote all of them.
Yay. I know. See, this is why we've got this guy on the show, because I knew that, Rex, and I'm glad.
Oh, well, that's good.
No, I'm glad everybody knows it now. It's hugely important. And by the way, you used the term, I think probably a lot of folks out there know, but I just want to be clear. You said VTOL, and we're talking about vertical takeoff and landing aircraft specifically. So now I'm going to go sideways on you for a second, because interestingly, like you said,
just a second.
Yeah, I know. Just scrolling for a second. The FAA used this VTOL word in the vertiport design standard, but there are these other aircraft out there people are chirping about, the electric STOL, right?
Right.
Short takeoff and landing, and then electric CTOL, which I think is conventional takeoff and landing. So what you're talking about here and what we're talking about when we talk about vertiports do not apply then, we think?
Currently, no. When you talk about vertiports, and I'd had this discussion with the FAA early on, and they said that this standard, and keep in mind that the engineering brief is not the final outcome. They're still working on an actual advisory circular for their standard. This is a stopgap measure to get the industry moving. But once the AC, the advisory circular, is published, if we are going to create something for that eSTOL, the short field takeoff and landing, it'll be a different standard.
Okay.
CTOL, I don't think there'll be a different standard for CTOL. CTOL is conventional takeoff and landing. So airports, we're basically converting airplanes from turbines to electric. So there's not going to be, I don't think, a different standard there. But the short field takeoff and landing, we've had stall ports in the past, but we don't really have any now. In doing the research, it was ironic. The place that I found that had a really fantastic stall port design diagram and document was out of Nepal. They have a stall
Interesting.
port document. And it makes sense because of the confined areas and the areas that they operate in out of Nepal.
Yeah.
Probably pretty hard to put an actual airport in there, but they have a
I mean,
stall port.
I've seen some of those movies. I feel like Batman was one. Wasn't that like where, the one with what's his name? Where he's like, training up there, like with
Oh,
the
I know.
monks
It's pretty
on the
awesome.
side of yeah, on the side of a mountain. Yeah, land something up there. Good luck. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, all right, vertiports. Let's talk now about vertipads.
So a vertipad still, we go back to that whole dialect of what is a helipad. So a vertipad still part of a vertiport or a vertistop. We use the same taxonomy for vertistop that we did for helistop.
Okay.
And if you look at the engineering brief, they actually, in the engineering brief, use the language I recommended in the NFPA guidelines, which talks about it's no refueling, no defueling, no maintenance, no repair or storage of the aircraft. We're waiting for the next heliport design advisory circular to be published, which will be 2 Delta. The last one, which was 2 Charlie, was published in 2012.
Okay.
That should actually have new language in it that we put in recommendations through the Vertical Flight Society, U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, and HAI. So,
All right, and HAI is the Helicopter Association International.
correct.
I know you're highly involved with them, and you've been for years. And our buddy Jonathan Daniels is also one of their advisors, I believe.
Yes, he is. He's my go-to guy besides you on drones.
There you go. There you go. I go to him all the time. Actually, he's just a font of knowledge. But let's complicate this even more, Rex, because even whether we're talking about a vertiport or excuse me, a heliport, or in the future a vertiport, not all of them are the same because there's this public-private dichotomy. So let's talk about the public-private distinction for heliports and give us some examples of that.
I would say it becomes a challenge. You really have to understand what it means to be public use versus private use, and public ownership versus private ownership. So I think one of the key differences, under current regulations, I foresee regulations being modified in the future. If you hold yourself out as a public use facility, be it an airport, heliport, or whatever, you have to be available to anyone in the public who is properly certificated and the aircraft's properly equipped. You can't say no. I think a lot of people assume that, well, it's public owned. I said, but they keep using the term public use, and that's use case is the key here. And if you by chance use federal grant money, now you have a lot of strings attached that you now have to meet all these criteria, this public use, public owned, and AIP. So most of the airports that are in the system that are in that area are like regional airports.
And AIP is Airport Infrastructure Program.
Airport Improvement Planning.
Airport Improvement Plan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And isn't a key point of this that the FAA has a hook because of the grant money or that public nature, that they have some oversight authority?
If you use federal grant monies, that then means that you are required to meet all the regulations that go with that. And there are, I want to say, and I'm not an expert in that field, but it's like 23 different documents that you now have to abide by. And I always tell people, I said, if you're going to get money, I said, ask for 4 times what you need, because it's going to take that much to bring you up to standard before you actually get a chance to use the money you want to use it for.
Holy shnikes. And so conversely, if you're not taking that money and you're doing it completely on a private use, private owned basis, FAA doesn't have authority or jurisdiction, incredibly.
Yeah, and that's a double-edged sword, because a lot of people, we're going to be private. I said, well, that's good, because if you're private, and we have worked really predominantly with the private industry, I've done some DoD and a few public, but the key is, if I'm private, I can make whatever guidelines, as long as they're not less restrictive than the FAA. I can work more restrictive guidelines. So I can say that only twin engine helicopters can land at my facility. Only helicopters that are pink with purple polka dots can land at my facility.
Yeah.
You have to have a letter of authorization. You have to have X number of dollars of insurance. I can go on and on and on.
But isn't a key point to that, Rex, that if the FAA isn't overseeing those, they may not even be tracking them at all from, let's just hypothetically say, a mapping standpoint, like where even these things are?
Well, it is a regulation on the books under Part 157 that if you have any landing area in the United States, you're supposed to submit documentation on it for just that purpose. Now, that being said, the FAA has no authority over private use. So you can have one of the most unsafe heliports or vertiports known to man, but if it's private use, they have no authority to make you do something. Only the state or the municipality has that authority. And in some cases, the states don't have anything on the books, and sometimes the municipality doesn't have anything on the books.
So you're supposed to report it, but if you don't, I mean, are there any teeth to that?
The only person that really has teeth would be the fire marshal, because
everybody else is toothless.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, now if the states have regulations on the book, so California, Illinois, Florida have regulations on the book that require you to design and build a heliport in accordance with the FAA standards. So it makes the FAA standard regulatory. Yeah. National Fire Protection Association points to the FAA advisory circular and says that the heliport shall be designed in accordance with it. So they use that wonderful term shall. Now, there are a lot of heliports out there that are substandard. They have 3 determinations you can get. You get concur with exception, or objectionable. Concur, this is the airspace determination. Hey, you did a great job. We love everything we see. We wouldn't change a thing. Concur with exception. Hey, you did a great job. Here's some of our recommendations. Light that, trim this, mark that, and you're good to go.
Okay.
Objectionable. We don't know what you were smoking when you came up with this idea, but this is the most dangerous thing we've seen lately. Oh, yikes. By the way, we can't do anything to stop you. Here's your location identifier. Please don't kill anybody.
Now, all of this that you're talking about, Rex, really is from the heliport world.
Correct.
How do you believe, because did the engineering brief bring this over, this public-private thing, into the vertiport standard, or do you anticipate public use, public-owned vertiports versus private use, private-owned vertiports?
Great question, and I don't have a good answer for you, other than I would point to the fact that the advisory circular that the heliports are developed to, it specifically states in there on page 1 that these are recommendations only.
Okay.
Now, if it's public use and you've accepted grant money, the FAA can force you to do something.
Okay.
But if it's private use, the FAA can't force you to do anything. Now, there is another term out there that a lot of state DOTs lean on heavily. It may be private, you're doing commercial operations. So they use commercial use at the state level to specifically say that, it's private, but since it's commercial, you have to uphold all the standards for public use. Okay. So that's going to require a regulation change in Part 77 and 157. Mm-hmm. And that's going to require an act of Congress to make that happen, to give the FAA any oversight.
Like literally.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could see, everybody, how much work needs to be done here. And it's really mind blowing when you start peeling this back with someone like Rex, who's been in this world forever. So let's talk about the kinds of locations that are being considered for vertiports in particular. Are we talking about rooftops, parking lots, repurposing small airports? I've heard some things about that. You just using heliports. And I think we have maybe a couple images here. So maybe let's roll that first one.
Yeah, so this is a rooftop. This is a high-rise building that we looked at, putting a landing area with a parking area, and you'll notice the parking area is actually an elevator. So this was one of the early concepts we did for a client. Those green and white striped circles, that's the FADO, the inner circle. The outer circle is a safety area. Those wouldn't be there. That's just for reference. So you'd have the landing platform, and then you'd have an area where you could go to park, and then the aircraft would go below deck and then park underneath. Whether that will be built or not, who knows? But this was my design and artist rendition for that I created.
That's super cool. There, we got another one here.
Now, this is on a parking deck. We looked at having 2 different landing areas with 3 parking areas and a terminal. We were looking at doing a renovation of an existing parking deck. Definitely doable. We just had to go through and look at the construction of the parking deck and make sure that the structural engineer could verify we had the excess strength in the building to support this. I think the biggest key when you get into elevated structures of any kind is if it's occupied structure, one, but if it's elevated, there's a higher bar that you have to clear for safety when it comes to building and fire code, whereas ground is less restrictive just because it has less hazards associated with it.
Yeah,
in this
I know.
case,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I said in that case, we basically looked at something that would actually support a throughput model of multiple takeoffs and landings. And then in this one, this was a similar idea based on the ground with a terminal. You can't see it in this simulation, but there were 3 teal-offs for 3 landing areas, and each teal-off had its own 3 parking areas with charging. And I built out the terminal based on a standard throughput for that number.
Wow. Okay. Very cool. Now, as a practical matter, are any of these actually being built today? Because, when you read the news, no, I mean, you're laughing, but, you hear all this chatter about, oh, look, Lilium's building stuff in Florida. They're going to be flying by
Right.
next year is what they originally said. So
Yeah.
like, are there any of these things out there right now, at least in the US?
I would say no. And the challenge is just because an engineering brief was published, we haven't set the system up yet for running that through the FAA for permitting or for airspace determination. So we have to create the forms for vertiports. We have to create the data capture for the terminology for vertiports. We really probably ought to have a regulation in place that actually says the term vertiport somewhere.
Yeah. And vertipad.
Yeah, it's
Or
one of those
vertideck.
things.
Vertideck.
Stop. Vertideck, vertistop, vertipad. Yeah. And then PILA, yeah. But one of the key elements here is we haven't trained anybody in the FAA. You have all these inspectors that they saw this the same time you saw it, and there's not a training program in place yet for the people that do the inspection and the people that do the airspace determination. So we still have all these things to go through and do before we start seeing people actually making applications for vertiports anytime soon.
Holy shnikes. Well, let's talk about why these are different, right? Like, so I think it comes back to the aircraft, right? So can you explain the difference between, and by the way, look, we're going to have to generalize here and do, no pun intended, 30,000 foot view because,
Gotcha.
right. The Vertical Flight Society that you mentioned earlier, huge fan, by the way, has their eVTOL directory that has over 700 different designs at all different kind of stages, right? From pen to, a sketch on a paper to, oh, this one actually is military certification like Joby and Beta Technologies aircraft. Can you just kind of give us a very high level why the difference in the aircraft matters when you're talking about the kind of infrastructure design, the vertiport design?
Yeah, well, I go into that for starters. Both are supposed to be able to do land and take off vertically, something helicopters have been doing fairly well for quite some time. But that said, eVTOL aircraft are designed around the concept of distributed electrical lift. In theory, this adds a huge element of redundancy. Also, it adds something that helicopters have had issue with for years, and that's noise. It uses electric versus turbine or piston-driven engine. That is always the one thing that we get pushed back in most communities is that noise. Now, I've heard this a couple of times from some good friends of mine in the aerospace engineering, and they're like, just because it's electric doesn't mean it's silent. There is noise. Now, how much and what the tolerance level is of that, yet to be seen. But that makes it more attractive, I think, from the standpoint of putting infrastructure in. in different areas. There are also several variations of eVTOL or VTOL and eVTOL themes out there. You get lift and cruise, quadcopter, vector thrust, tilt rotor, tilt wing, and several others. Each design has its pluses and minuses. The key question is, what are the aerodynamic deficiencies? Where it's aerodynamic Achilles heel. So for helicopters, we have things like settling with power and vortex ring state that we design infrastructure around because we know about those. It's kind of like an airplane. We all know that an airplane will stall if you go too slow.
Okay.
Well, we design airports so that you got enough runway that you're never going to go that slow.
Okay.
Heliports, we make sure that the approach departure paths are always into the wind to the extent possible, because we know downwind operations are a bad thing. You can get into vortex ring state or settling with power. Weathercock stability, loss of tail rotor effectiveness, those are things that we know about for helicopters.
Gotcha.
I don't know yet what an eVTOL's aerodynamic Achilles heel is. We've been told that they could potentially be more susceptible to vortex ring state than a helicopter.
Okay, so downwind, so build downwind, right? Is that what you said?
Well, the settings that you need really to get into that is a steep approach, 20 to 100% of power applied, and a descent rate of 300 feet or greater.
But you're kind of guessing based on experience. I mean, this is an academic guesstimate.
Well, it was in a white paper that was published in Germany, and it was pretty thorough, and it's been interesting to see this. Now, if you go on to the YouTube, type in drone and type in vortex ring state. There are a lot of people that crash drones on a regular basis that get into vortex ring state and have no idea why their drone just crashed. What it is they get into their own downwash and they're settling through that downwash, and instead of flying out of it laterally, they try to power out. When they power out, all they do is accelerate faster into the ground.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Some people call it the wobble of death.
The wobble of death. All right. That sounds really, really bad if you're flying passengers and landing.
Yeah, it's not a good thing. And
that sounds really horrible. But
yeah,
I want to talk for a minute, Rex, about, you kind of alluded to this because I know you've been involved quite a bit in these zoning board hearings for heliports in particular, where the neighbors come out in droves, with pitchforks. They don't want that heliport in their neighborhood. Do you anticipate, first of all, what are you mentioned noise. What are the concerns, the primary concerns, maybe top three? And do you see these translating over into, kind of the vertiport or advanced air mobility world?
No, I think safety is number one. Noise is number two. Property values are right up there. What's the impact of your vertiport or heliport going to have on my property values? Environmental impact. I've had to actually do research on what the impact of a heliport and flight would be to bald eagles. I once had to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wouldn't have any impact on an endangered turtle once. So you never know what you're going to get. But I think one of the key elements when we look at how we classify all these private use heliports, and somebody said something, we're just going to convert all these heliports. And I'm like, probably not a good idea, because most are private, and most private heliports are under a conditional use permit. And a conditional use permit usually has restrictions that you wouldn't want to live with.
Okay.
Time of day, daylight only.
And those permits are local. Those are local state.
Exactly. That's a municipality thing.
Yeah, that's a municipality thing. Okay.
They're very restrictive in most cases, and you wouldn't want to build a business model around something that's that restrictive, because they say you can't do maintenance, you can't do fuel, you can only do 4 operations a day, you can only use one type of aircraft, you can only daylight hours only. And we make a lot of concessions to put heliports in today at private facilities. And there's only 54 public use heliports in the United States out of over 6,000.
So, Rex, you've talked about this before. I know you've testified before the FAA multiple times, because we talked about like what's on the map, if you will, like what is documented out there. And I know you've expressed concerns that there are a whole host of, I don't know if they're helipads, helidecks. There's a whole host of important kind of landing areas for helicopters alone that are not properly, that are not really documented. Is that right? And tell us a little bit about that.
No, there's a challenge there. We did a study back in 2019 for NASA, and we came up with an estimation that there's at least 2,000 heliports in existence today that the FAA is not tracking. Now, it's not the FAA's fault.
No, is this like people are supposed to be telling them, hey, we built one here, and they're not?
Yeah, well, again, we go back to part 157 under the CFR says that if you're going to have one, you're supposed to alert the FAA and file a Form 7480 and get a 5010, so you're in the system. The National Airspace System knows you exist.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we did a study in Ohio. We looked at every hospital, and we found 44 hospitals that had heliports that were not on record. And that's a big deal when we look at beyond visual line of sight UAS operations.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
how do I know that you exist, and how do I avoid you, or at least be alerted to you if you're not in the system?
Yeah.
Now, it's been an uphill fight for the last 30 plus years to get some of these in the system. There have been rather hard to, now with the prospect of drones and beyond line of sights, all of a sudden people are starting to pay attention and say, well, I need to make sure that my landing area is in the system. It's a staffing issue. It's a priority issue. Again, the FAA doesn't go out and look at these once they're in the system, they don't go back and look. We've had several that have been moved that still show up in the old location, sometimes 4 or 5 miles away. There was one in Nashville, Tennessee. There's a TV station on the north side of Nashville. It's got a heliport. It's mislocated by some 55 statute miles. So,
Oh my
say you're a drone operator and you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. You would never see this on any of the apps that are out there because they're all pulling from the same database. And that's the problem we run into is data integrity is a huge issue in this next generation of technology, especially when we start talking autonomous. We have to get a handle on better data accuracy, accountability.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. When you think about autonomous vehicles, or, you know, even just the concept of artificial, you know, it's like garbage in, garbage out. Like it's your mission, your performance is only as good as the information or the data that you have like already ingested. And if it's not there, that's truly a frightening prospect. But man, Rex, I've got like a page of questions we're not getting to. I want to talk about drone ports and pivot, because you mentioned.
Oh no, good
Well,
topic.
it's a great way to end this show, because if your mind isn't blown right now already, it's going to be when we talk about drone ports, because there's not even a definition anywhere for this. Is that right?
As far as I know, no one's come up with a definition. We've asked several times over the years, and I don't know why there's this resistance within the FAA to define what a drone port is. It's like, per the regulation, anything that moves through the air is an aircraft. Congress went out of their way to say drones are aircraft and drone operators are pilots.
Right.
The FAA 157 specifically says, it talks about what's an airport, and it's got this laundry list: airports, heliports, drone or vertiports. It even has the word vertiport in there, even though it's not defined.
Wow.
Seaplane bases. But then it's a caveat in there: any place that you basically land or take off is an airport.
Wow.
What's a drone port? What's a drone port? What's the standard I have to meet to put in one? And how do I account for it in the National Airspace System so everybody else knows I exist? And, you know, we mark prohibited areas, restricted areas. We have this thing called alert areas, high volume traffic. I said, you know, my thought was a year ago, I said, well, at least I ought to say this is an alert area so I, as a pilot, know to avoid that place. Because some of these places that we're looking at in Salt Lake City with a Wing, down in Bentonville, Arkansas with Walmart.
Yeah, drone up.
Yeah, 50, 60, 75,000 operations a year or more, out to 60 miles.
Yeah, I mean, that's significant, right? And again, like, what is that infrastructure, you know, like, what's that infrastructure supposed to look like? It's one thing if you're chucking one of those, you know, those twisty, like, pop out things, you know, the circle, you know, that you're throwing that on the ground or somewhere. But I've seen some, I mean, you know, Drone Up, as an example, has a really cool, I think they're calling it the Drone Hub, right? It almost looks like, I'm going to like go back to my Philly roots here. If you go down the Jersey Shore, you know, they have some of the more robust, like, lifeguard stands, you know,
Right.
that are all boxed in.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
it almost looks like that, like in my brain, that's where it goes, you know, but it's like, all right, that's cool. But like what standards apply to any of these things, right? Like, so again, I don't believe in just regulating for regulation's sake, but just for safety consistency across the board. And like you said, reporting like, hey, we're here.
Yeah. So
That
how
seems
do you
kind of,
account for it?
yeah, that
I mean,
seems kind of,
that's the only thing. Now, I understand if you're operating a drone and you're going out and doing something in the field, you're taking video at a location, you're
oh
doing
yeah,
an
that's
inspection. That's a totally different
right,
animal.
right. To be like, oh, I've got a,
Yeah.
you know, an airport right now. Like, don't bother me. Like,
No,
hey,
no,
I
no.
deserve to get that
This
airport
is
tax money.
you have a commercial hub the size of Walmart moving thousands of packages a week. All right. That's kind of significant. You're doing commercial operations. You are an aircraft and you are operating out of, as defined by the FAA, an airport, but we don't define what that is. We talked about this. I think you, myself, and our good friend Don Burkhoff is like
Yep.
the Senate subcommittee is having FAA reauth meetings right now
Yep.
on
2023
this
when that,
specific
yep.
topic.
Yes.
Now we're in the throes of elections, so I don't see a whole lot happening right now.
Oh
But
yeah.
now we're working behind the scenes trying to get people from HAI, Helicopter Association International, my good friend Jim Viola, people from Vertical Flight Society, Mike Hirschberg,
Yep.
and then some other folks to include Jonathan Daniels and myself to get in front of this group and give them some education on this is what we have, this is what we need to fix before we move forward, and this is what we need in the future.
Right.
Because we can put it in the act, but if we don't get the funding, it's never going
Yeah.
to happen. So we got to get something in writing, and we got to get it funded at the same time. So we're diligently trying to pull those strings, move this along, and get something done so that we can help the FAA move this forward.
Well, I'll tell you what, Rex, I totally agree. You need the money to go with that because, you know, I've lived the dream being in the military as long as I have. All, you know, like we call it the unfunded mandate.
Oh
It's like
yeah,
you're telling me to do X and Y and you're giving me no money to do it. So
I
at
know.
some
Yeah,
point,
it's like you
you
can't do
know,
anything with that.
yeah, something's got to give, right? Absolutely. All right, we are almost at time, which is kind of crazy. But I want to ask you this question because it's fun and I don't know what your answer is going to be.
Okay,
If you were king of the world for the day,
for the day.
what is the one thing you would do in this kind of vertiport, drone port arena? What's the one thing you would do or change?
The one thing that I do, I think I would focus on revising the regulations because we've been dealing with regulations that are very outdated already, and they don't speak to low-level infrastructure like they should. So when we look at part one, we got to get the terminology right, harmonize the terminology across all regulations and all
And
divisions.
internationally, please. That would be
Well, yeah,
wonderful.
if we can, you're asking for
There's that.
miracles. You're asking for
Yeah.
miracles
I
with
know we don't play well in the
unicorns.
sandbox
Yeah,
sometimes.
that's a unicorn that has a rainbow coming out its butt. But I think revision of Part 77 and 157 to make it more streamlined. Get the terminology right, get the forms right, get that set because we're needing a better foundation. If we keep building on the foundation we got, we're going to have troubles for years. If we can fix the foundation, beef it up, it'll be a whole lot easier 10 years from now. We won't be having these issues, but we need to. Regulations in the FAA take forever. It's a 6-year process on a good day.
Yeah.
We might be able to streamline it, but I doubt it. If we don't start now, it'll never get done. So
Yeah.
if I was that guy, that's what I would tackle.
All right. Well, it's a worthy endeavor to be sure. So we'll see. I wish you the best of luck, you and all of your colleagues working behind the scenes for the FAA Reauthorization Act to get some not only cents but also dollars to go with the cents,
Exactly.
SENSE. Okay, cents and cents. Shall we say in both
Yep.
terms, both meanings of that word. All right, so we are like 2 minutes out, almost at our close here, and we're at the end of the year, Rex. How can, how can people see you? How can they meet you? How can they find you?
Well, I do a lot of training and education. So I do teach for the Transportation Safety Institute down in Oklahoma City do some of their road shows for heliport courses. I do teach their accident investigation course or part of that. I do also, if you're interested in me coming out and doing lectures and training and being a speaker, I do that all over the world, really. Um, the biggest place that I put stuff up is on LinkedIn. I do have
Yes.
the company has a LinkedIn. I have a LinkedIn, also have Twitter, and we put a lot of content out there. But LinkedIn's probably where I'm the most vocal. Working on a website. Heaven forbid I get more freaking business, because I don't know that I have the bandwidth to even attempt more business.
It's a good problem to have, my friend.
No, it's good. But so I'd say, yeah, those are probably the key areas that I would see. Now, I will be at the Vertical Flight Society's eVTOL Symposium in Mesa, Arizona in January. I will be at Heli Expo in Atlanta, Georgia, in the first week of March. I run a symposium. It's an invite only, but I'll be in Washington, D.C. in February for the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. Beyond that, I haven't planned that far.
You usually go to Oshkosh. That's a big thing for you every year.
I always go to
Like,
Oshkosh. I love
yeah.
Oshkosh. I try to go there for at least 5, if not the whole 7 days. I run around with a group called Aero News Network. They let me pretend that I'm a journalist. So I get
Yeah.
to get a press pass and get to talk to people.
Yeah, it's one of
So,
his hidden talents. The guy can write too, by the way. So,
oh,
um, many
I need an
talents.
editor, like, big time. I'm
Very,
dyslexic as all get out.
well, very good. All right, Rex. Well, I think that's it. Any closing comments? Any final thoughts here?
No, I think it's a very interesting, very exciting industry at the time right now, and we're seeing technology is racing. We just got to get policy to catch up a little bit, I think. So the one thing I will leave you with is, now that everybody has learned what a vertiport is, there are people coming out of the woodwork that I would be careful of. There are a lot of charlatans out there looking to separate you from your money. Make sure that you're getting somebody that actually knows something about vertical lift and vertical transportation before you sign a deal to build a vertiport, because I've seen a lot of people coming out that I have no idea who these people are. And I start talking and they have no clue what I'm saying. And I'm like, you should know this. This is basic stuff.
Got it. Got it. Yes. Well, it's always, as they say in the law, caveat emptor, buyer beware.
Amen to
So
that.
it's a good note to end on. And you know what? That's all she wrote. We are out here.
Take care.